What if I told you that everything you believe might be wrong? Since we were kids, we've been taught to look for purpose, to believe in destiny, or to hope that somehow life will make sense. But for Albert Camus, that's the biggest illusion of all. He reminds us of something deeply unsettling. The universe doesn't care about us, life doesn't offer answers, and hope, most of the time, is just a comforting lie. This is the core of the absurd, the clash between our desperate need for meaning and the cold silence of the world. But there's a dark side to waking up to this truth. Because when all the illusions fall away, what's left is emptiness, loneliness, and a brutal kind of clarity that can feel unbearable. Today, we're not going to talk about the hopeful Camus that people like to remember. We're going to look at the Camus who stared straight into the horror of existing in a meaningless universe. 1. The absurd as a tragic awareness of the human condition. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed about life, purpose, justice, destiny, was nothing more than a fragile construction. Just a story we tell ourselves to get through the emptiness. That's exactly where Albert Camus invites us to stop and face the void. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." That's the essence of the absurd. Human beings crave meaning, coherence, and a truth that justifies our pain and struggle to exist. But the universe responds with indifference. No signs, no explanations, no promises. It's not an easy idea to digest, and Camus knew that. He doesn't offer easy answers or any mystical way out. Instead, he forces us to look directly at the raw truth. We live in a world that owes us nothing, and yet demands everything from us. This realization sparks a new kind of awareness, what we might call a tragic consciousness. Tragic not in the melodramatic sense, but in the ancient Greek sense of tragedy, the recognition that life is limited, full of contradictions, and inevitably ends. And even so, we must keep going. Camus builds this idea around a powerful image, the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, over and over, for eternity. To Camus, Sisyphus is the portrait of modern humanity, a person who keeps on living, even knowing their efforts may never lead anywhere. But there's a big difference between the absurd and despair. Camus isn't telling us to give up. In fact, it's the opposite. The realization of the absurd is actually a kind of awakening, a moment of extreme clarity when we stop living under illusions and start seeing the world as it really is, harsh, unpredictable, and essentially meaningless. That clarity, though, comes at a high cost. When we understand that all our certainties can collapse, religious, philosophical, even scientific, we're hit with a deep sense of emptiness. Suddenly, there's no more absolute why, and that can be terrifying. Camus calls this the first step of philosophy, realizing that meaning is not given and maybe never will be. In his words, deciding whether or not life is worth living is the fundamental question of philosophy. And this is where Camus separates himself from other thinkers. He doesn't look for comfort in God or in some higher truth. He chooses to face reality head-on. So what does it mean to live with this awareness? It means being awake, living with the knowledge that there's no final reward, no path already written. It means giving up the idea that everything happens for a reason and still choosing to act, choosing to love, to create, to resist, even without the promise of meaning. And that's where we find the darkest side of Camus's thinking. Because this absurd clarity doesn't bring comfort. Quite the opposite. It isolates us. It pulls us away from the safe ground of shared beliefs and drops us into an impersonal world where human life has no objective value. It's the collapse of the reason to live. And yet, in that collapse, Camus also finds a strange kind of freedom. When nothing is given, everything becomes possible. When the universe sets no moral rules, human beings become radically free. But that freedom isn't romantic, it's heavy. Because now, everything depends on us. The awareness of the absurd, then, isn't just an existential diagnosis. It's a stance, a way of facing life, an ethic without transcendence, a way to commit to existence even when it feels pointless. This is where Camus comes close to the ancient Greek tragedians. He doesn't offer redemption, but dignity, a dignity built not on the meaning of life, but on the courage to live it anyway. And maybe the most painful part of this tragic awareness is loneliness. Because when we let go of illusions, we often find ourselves apart from the crowd. While many still rely on promises of salvation, the absurd man walks alone. He doesn't reject others, but he knows his clarity sets him apart. In the end, the absurd is a form of tragic love for truth, a love that won't settle for half answers or comforting lies, a love that would rather suffer with open eyes than live in blissful ignorance. And that's what makes Camus feel so relevant today. In times of crisis, fake news, easy answers, and ideological extremes, Camus forces us to pause and ask, are we willing to live without lies? The absurd isn't an enemy to be defeated, it's a condition to be accepted. And when we do, we're not surrendering, we're freeing ourselves, because only when we admit the universe has no meaning can we start to build our own, even if it's brief, even if it's tragic. Have you ever felt that kind of absurd awakening Camus describes? What do you do when the answers you were taught no longer work? Have you ever had that strange moment where everything just feels pointless? Wake up, brush your teeth, catch the bus, work, eat lunch, come back home, watch something random, go to sleep. Repeat. Days passing by like they're all the same. And then suddenly something inside you whispers, what's the point of all this? It's in that quiet, almost invisible moment that the absurd shows its most intimate face. You don't need a tragedy or a spiritual crisis to feel the emptiness. Sometimes, all it takes is the mechanical repetition of daily life. Albert Camus understood this with a disturbing clarity. He knew that the absurd doesn't just appear in dramatic events. It shows up in the boredom of a lonely breakfast, in the silence of a meaningless Sunday, in the built-up exhaustion of weeks that blur together. For him, daily life is a minefield of dark epiphanies, where awareness, once awakened, can be overwhelming. At the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, Camus doesn't describe the absurd as something grand or spectacular, but as the return of strangeness. He writes, on a day when everything seems clear, the machinery of life breaks down, and everything begins to seem strange. You look at your hand, at your reflection in the mirror, at the automatic movement of people around you, and everything feels off, as if life keeps going, but without you in it. This feeling echoes deeply in Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, although Sartre takes a different path than Camus. His main character, Roquentin, is hit with existential nausea when he realizes the lack of foundation behind all things. Just staring at a tree root makes him feel the absurdity of existence. Everything is too much, everything is unnecessary, everything just is, with no reason. And here comes a disturbing truth. The everyday world, the one where we usually seek comfort and stability, can become the most suffocating place of all when meaning fades away. Because no distraction is strong enough to silence the question echoing in the back of your mind, is this all there is? Repetition becomes cruel when you no longer believe in the why, ye. When daily rituals lose their symbolic meaning and goals feel like obligations imposed from the outside, ordinary life turns into a prison without bars. It's no surprise Camus says, habit is the great anesthetic. But the problem with anesthetics is that sometimes they wear off, and then we feel the raw pain of existence. That's what an existential crisis is, the moment when everything we used to lean on, routine, work, religion, even relationships, no longer protects us from the void. The machine keeps turning, but we're no longer emotionally inside it, and clarity turns into discomfort, a lucidity that cuts through everything we once thought was solid. Camus doesn't deny this pain. He sees it as real. More than that, as necessary. Because only when daily life reveals its emptiness are we forced to face the absurd condition of being alive. And that's when true freedom begins. But that freedom comes at a price. It demands responsibility, because if there's no given meaning, no higher purpose, then it's up to us to create one. There's no script, no map, no promise of salvation. Everything depends on what we choose to do, even knowing the universe will stay silent. Camus challenges us to keep moving forward without the comfort of a why beyond ourselves. To wake up every day and face the routine not as a punishment, but as a tragic and paradoxically free choice. He writes, "The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. It becomes a problem only when man becomes aware of it. This means the absurd isn't out there. It's born in the space between us and the world. It's when we look at our lives and ask, 'Now what?' And that question, as painful as it feels, holds incredible power. Because inside it lies the seed of revolt. The absurd revolt, which Camus explores later, begins when we refuse both resignation and despair. When, even in the face of nothingness, we choose to stand. But let's be honest, it's hard. Sometimes just getting out of bed feels like a battle. The boredom, the repetition, the sense that we're living on autopilot, it's all heavy. That's why this existential crisis is more common than we think, and more human than we'd like to admit. So, if you've ever felt this way, disconnected from your routine, hollow inside, know this: you're not broken. You're waking up. You're seeing the world without filters, and that pain might be the beginning of something real. The key isn't to run from the routine, it's to reinvent it, to give new meaning to simple actions, to create small acts of rebellion against the void, reading a book that challenges you, having an honest conversation, writing something true, rejecting the superficial. Each gesture can be a spark of meaning. Even in a world that offers none, the routine will still be there, but you get to decide how you'll live inside it. None of us can escape it. No matter what we do, what we achieve, how much we love or fear, the only absolute certainty in life is that it ends. For many people, that's an unbearable thought. We'd rather look away, find distractions, or hold on to hopes of continuity, whether in an afterlife or in the legacy we leave behind. But for Albert Camus, death is not a tragic ending to be denied. It's the ultimate proof of the absurd. At the heart of absurdist philosophy, Camus tells us that the absurd isn't just the lack of meaning between humans and the world. It's the certainty of death clashing with our desperate desire to stay. We are conscious beings who know we're going to die, yet we live as if that's not true. We build routines, chase stability, accumulate things, as if time were endless. But it's not. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes, "Killing oneself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much. But before that, there's another silent confession, that living with the awareness of death and still not running from that truth is one of the hardest tasks of being human. Because the more aware we are of the end, the more meaningless everything might seem. And that's exactly where the darkest side of absurd consciousness lives. Death reduces us. It strips away our illusions. No achievement can resist time. No story remains untouched. There is no eternal glory, no cosmic justice. Even those who believe in some form of transcendence must admit, no one comes back to tell us what's on the other side. From the universe's perspective, we die, and life goes on. This realization, that the universe is indifferent to our death, is a hard blow to the human ego. For centuries, we've been taught to believe our lives have a greater purpose, that there's a plan, a reward, or a continuation. But Camus cuts that hope at the root. He asks, what if none of that exists? What if life is just what you have right now, finite, fragile, and without redemption? Many people refuse to really think about that, and it's understandable. Facing death directly is also facing the risk that everything might be irrelevant. That no effort, no prayer, no theory will save us from being forgotten. That's why Camus presents us with a radical dilemma. What do we do with life, knowing it ends? This isn't just a philosophical question. It's deeply personal. Because unlike comforting beliefs, absurd lucidity offers no relief. It offers responsibility. Death, as the only certain horizon, forces us to rethink the value of every moment. It makes us see time not as a straight and predictable line, but as a present moment that fades with every second. Camus challenges us to live as if every gesture were the last, not out of fear, but out of honesty. Still, this kind of clarity comes with a quiet danger, the feeling that nothing matters. If everything ends, what's the point of starting anything? Why love if everything fades? Why build if everything falls apart? Why live if we're going to die? These are fair questions, and Camus doesn't dismiss them. In fact, he uses them as a starting point. Absurd philosophy doesn't erase the fear of death. It recognizes it as a central part of being alive. And by doing that, it invites us to create meaning, not from something outside of us, but from within. To live under the shadow of death is to live with intensity, not with panic or despair, but with presence. It's choosing what's real over illusions. It's refusing to wait for eternity to make the now matter. Camus proposes a quiet rebellion, to keep living even while knowing everything will end. And that choice, as paradoxical as it sounds, is what makes us truly free. Because once we stop chasing eternal salvation, we're forced to value the finite. That doesn't mean ignoring death. It means accepting it, bringing it into our awareness, not as a threat, but as a reminder. You are alive right now, and that's enough. The image of Sisyphus comes back even stronger here. Pushing the boulder endlessly, knowing it will always fall, and doing it anyway, is the ultimate symbol of absurd resistance. The effort is useless, but he keeps going. And in that hopeless act, there's a kind of greatness. Camus ends the myth of Sisyphus with a famous line. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy, not because he found meaning, but because he accepted the absence of it and still chose to live with dignity. Recognizing death as the only certainty shouldn't paralyze us. It should wake us up. Because when the end is inevitable, life becomes more precious, more urgent, more real. Every gesture, every word, every breath carries a unique weight. The absurd is not an invitation to despair. It's an invitation to courage. The courage to live without guarantees, to love without promises, to create, to resist, to keep going, even knowing that the end will come. Imagine living in a world where nothing, absolutely nothing, responds to your feelings, your losses, or your attempts to connect. Not God, not destiny, not even the people around you. Imagine realizing that the universe not only doesn't understand you, it simply doesn't care. This is the cold ground where Camus plants one of his most brutal and honest works, The Stranger. In this story, we meet Meursault, a seemingly simple, almost apathetic man who commits what seems to be a senseless murder. He is put on trial, but not just for the crime itself. He's judged for his lack of emotion, for not crying at his mother's funeral, for refusing to pretend to feel something he doesn't. Meursault becomes a dark mirror of our condition. He is the one who doesn't lie, who refuses to perform society's emotional rituals. And because of that, he is condemned, not for killing, but for not meeting the expectations of a world that demands masks. So what's so disturbing about Meursault? It's that he represents a truth many people would rather avoid. The clear awareness that the world in itself is indifferent to our existence. That there is no cosmic justice, no guaranteed empathy. Life happens without asking us. We will die, and that won't change the course of the universe. Camus uses Meursault as a symbol of the individual fully aware of the absurd, a man who doesn't escape reality with illusions, and because of that, ends up alienated, out of place, alone. And here's something important to understand. Meursault's alienation isn't just social, it's existential. It's not just that he feels disconnected from others. It's that he sees himself completely isolated in a silent universe. A universe that offers no answers, no comfort. A universe that judges him by rules he no longer recognizes. As the novel unfolds, that sense of alienation becomes heavier. Meursault watches the world with a gaze that seems distant, but in truth, it's deeply lucid. He doesn't search for meaning where there is none. He doesn't fake emotion. He simply exists. And that unfiltered existence becomes his sentence. Society, in The Stranger, demands emotional conformity. It wants him to feel guilty, to suffer, to repent. It expects him to perform proper grief, to cry for his mother, to declare love for a woman, to seek forgiveness from God. Meursault, however, offers none of that. And this refusal to play along, to participate in the collective lie, is what truly scandalizes people. Because Meursault exposes the illusion. And when the world is confronted with that truth, it responds with rejection. Camus shows us that the indifference of the universe isn't the only issue. There's also the indifference of society, the lack of real empathy, the tendency to judge those who won't pretend. And that creates the deepest kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of being fully conscious in a world that chooses to stay asleep. Meursault, alone in his prison cell, waiting for death, reaches the height of this solitude. And it's there, paradoxically, that he finds his freedom. He fully accepts the absurd. He accepts that there is no meaning, no transcendence, no final justice. He accepts that he's going to die and that the world will go on as if nothing ever happened. And still, he chooses to say yes to life. He writes, "For the first time, I opened myself to the tender indifference of the world." That line, so gentle and yet so sharp, reveals the core of Camus' absurd philosophy. The universe's indifference isn't evil. It's not a punishment. It simply exists. The world doesn't hate us. It just doesn't hear us. Faced with that, the individual has two options: either rebel with bitterness, demanding answers that will never come, or accept the indifference with dignity and choose to live anyway. In that sense, alienation becomes a form of clarity. You can't truly belong to a world that demands lies, but you can live in it with awareness. You can resist its coldness without denying it. With The Stranger, Camus shows us that living the absurd to its fullest is also a form of courageous lucidity, and that this clarity can be lonely, yes, but it doesn't have to be empty. Meursault is not a hero. He is perhaps a martyr of truth, a man who refuses to pretend just to be accepted, and that refusal forces us to look at ourselves. How often do we say what others want to hear instead of what we truly feel? How often do we fake meaning, love, faith, or regret just to avoid being rejected? The alienation Camus exposes isn't just something imposed by the universe. It's also a result of a society that prefers the performance over honesty. That's why The Stranger still feels so relevant today. We live in a time where we're constantly pressured to perform. Success, happiness, spirituality, and the one who dares not to fake it becomes a stranger. But maybe, like Meursault, we need to accept that condition, to embrace the indifference of the world, and still affirm our own freedom, because in the end, the universe will remain silent, but we can still choose what to do with that silence. What if you suddenly found out that you are completely free? Free from absolute obligations, free from eternal commandments, free from any destiny set by God, history, or nature. Sounds liberating, right? Maybe. But for Camus, this radical freedom is also a silent curse. Once we realize the universe is indifferent and that there's no higher meaning telling us what to do, we find ourselves staring into an abyss. Everything is possible, but nothing is justified. There's no longer a universal moral structure to guide us, no more ought to guaranteed by a god, a metaphysical truth, or a cosmic plan. There's only you, with your own mind, your own choices, your own consequences. This is absurd freedom, total but unsupported. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus shows that once someone becomes aware of the absurd, they're no longer bound by inherited rules. You don't need to justify your life with some higher purpose, but that doesn't mean you live without responsibility. It means you must create, day after day, your own path, knowing there's no solid ground beneath your feet. At first, this feels empowering, freeing, almost euphoric. But soon comes the anxiety. Because when everything is allowed, nothing is certain. Without an absolute standard to tell right from wrong, good from evil, beautiful from ugly, how do you decide? How do you act? How do you carry the weight of a freedom that has no anchor outside yourself? Camus doesn't offer shortcuts. He rejects both destructive nihilism and blind faith in absolute truths. Instead, he proposes a third way, tragic clarity. You are free, but that freedom is full of anxiety. You can do anything, but you must carry the burden of justifying every step yourself. Absurd freedom, then, is a burden. It's knowing that life has no script, but still needs to be lived with honesty. It's the weight of being the sole author of your existence, on a stage where the set keeps changing, but the audience stays silent. That kind of freedom is scary, and that's why many people run from it. Most would rather go back to the familiar, to religious, cultural, or ideological rules that come pre-packaged, offering meaning, morality, and direction. But Camus warns us that return to comfort is a form of betrayal. It's an escape from the absurd. He writes, "Freedom is nothing if it doesn't include the right to make mistakes. True freedom demands the courage to be wrong, the courage to not know, the courage to act, even in the face of uncertainty. And that hurts, because we're raised to seek safety, to obey, to follow paths already mapped out. But the absurd person is someone who chooses to create their own way, even knowing it might lead nowhere. That is both the greatness and the curse of Camus' view of freedom. It's not a romantic celebration of independence. It's a tragic experience of awareness, because the freer we become, the further we move from the illusion that someone, or something, is coming to save us. Camus rejects both nihilism and fanaticism. He wants a human being who fully accepts the responsibility of their freedom, but doesn't use that freedom to dominate, destroy, or hide. Still, he knows. That's rare. It's much easier to turn freedom into cruelty or cynicism. And that's why he wrote The Rebel years after the myth of Sisyphus, to show how misusing freedom can lead to terror. When a person decides to kill in the name of absolute ideas, revolution, nation, progress, they betray absurd freedom, because they turn their anxiety into violence. Camus warns, there is no justification for murder in the name of a better future. Radical freedom is no excuse for totalitarianism or indifference. In the end, the challenge is this: how can we be free and still act responsibly? How can we create our own values without falling into moral emptiness? How can we live without God and still reject evil? Camus responds with an ethics of the present, an ethics of the here and now. If meaning isn't given, then we create meaning through real experiences, through love, through art, through solidarity. Not because these things save us, but because even in the absurd, they resist. So, radical freedom is not a shout of recklessness. It's a moral responsibility. It's looking at the world and saying, nothing forces me. And precisely because of that, I choose not to harm. I choose to act with dignity, even if no one's watching. It's an act of philosophical maturity and also of deep loneliness. Because on that path, you will often walk alone, without divine approval, without social guarantees, without promises of eternity, but with integrity, with authenticity, with courage. Albert Camus begins the myth of Sisyphus with a punch-in-the-gut line. There is only one truly serious philosophical question: suicide. He could have started anywhere else: ethics, knowledge, politics. But no, Camus goes straight to the core of existence. If life is absurd, is it still worth living? That simple, brutal question is the starting point of absurdist philosophy. Because if life has no ultimate meaning, if the universe doesn't care, and if death is inevitable, then why keep going? Camus doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't treat the topic like a taboo. In fact, he faces suicidal thoughts as a logical response to the absurd. If life has no purpose, then choosing not to live might seem reasonable, and that's exactly why Camus takes the question seriously. Ignoring it would be a way of avoiding clarity, but what he finds is even more disturbing. Suicide, although logical, is also a form of surrender. It's like admitting that the absurd has won. It's saying, I can't handle the lack of meaning, so I'm leaving the game. To Camus, that reaction is understandable, but it's also giving up the one true freedom we actually have: to keep living, even without any guarantees. He writes, to decide whether life is worth living or not is to answer the fundamental question of philosophy. That means every other philosophical reflection only matters after this question is faced. And it's not just a private issue, it's universal, because all of us, at some point, come face to face with that gap between our hunger for meaning and the silence of the universe. Camus doesn't call suicide cowardice. He doesn't moralize it. He respects its power as a real option, but he offers a different answer: revolt. To live, for Camus, is to resist the absurd, to reject both illusions and escape. Suicide solves the problem by eliminating the person who's asking the question. But living within the absurd is a much greater challenge: to stay awake, clear-eyed, and unmedicated. And that's where Camus separates himself from other existentialist thinkers. Kierkegaard, when faced with the absurd, turns to faith, a leap toward God. Sartre insists on radical freedom as the source of meaning, but Camus refuses both. For him, there's no leap and no hidden essence to discover. There's only the absurd, and the task is to live with it without escaping. His refusal of suicide is not based on hope, but on courage. The absurd man is the one who accepts the emptiness and still chooses to live. He knows there's no final why, but he creates temporary ones. He knows death is coming, but doesn't rush it. He resists. Camus gives this stance a name: revolt. To revolt against the absurd doesn't mean defeating it. It means refusing to be crushed by it. It's a kind of metaphysical stubbornness. Living without reason is an act of defiance. That might sound cold, but in truth, it's deeply human, because Camus understands the very real desire to give up. He doesn't judge it. He acknowledges it. But then, he points toward another path, turning meaninglessness into a space for creation. He writes, to live is to keep the absurd alive. In other words, to live is to hold on to that tension between our need for meaning and the silence of the world, to not let one cancel out the other, to stay in the clash, the friction, even when it hurts. Suicide ends the dialogue. Absurd life keeps it going. That's why Camus insists, suicide is not the answer. Not because it's wrong in some moral sense, but because it shuts down our one shot at freedom, the chance to carve out a path, even without guarantees. But let's be clear, Camus isn't romanticizing pain. He doesn't tell us to fake happiness. He tells us to be lucid, to accept that there will be days of emptiness, exhaustion, and nausea, and still to choose to go on. Suicide ends the story. Living in the absurd means writing pages with no ending. It's like pushing the boulder up the hill again and again, knowing it will fall, and still finding dignity in the act. Camus ends his book with the famous line, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." Happy, not because he found some secret meaning, but because he accepted the absurd and chose to affirm life anyway. This is the core of Camus's philosophy: to recognize suicidal thought as logical, but to overcome it through revolt. To go on, not out of hope, but out of dignity. And here's where it becomes personal. Because that question, is life worth living, isn't abstract. It might come knocking during times of loss, burnout, or loneliness. And Camus gives us an answer that's harsh, but honest. Yes, it's worth it. Because living is the only way to keep the conversation alive. To stop living is to go silent. To live is to insist. From a young age, we're taught to hope. Hope that tomorrow will be better. Hope that our pain will make sense. Hope that there's something more, a destiny, redemption, a bigger plan. Hope seems harmless, even noble. But to Albert Camus, it's dangerous. In the myth of Sisyphus, he describes hope not as a virtue, but as an escape. A sweet lie that pulls us away from the raw truth of the absurd. Camus calls it bluntly, a kind of metaphysical cowardice. Why cowardice? Because to hope is to hand the present over to the future, to delay living now in favor of something that might never come. It's a refusal to face the limits of our lives. It's a way to avoid confronting life as it truly is, by betting everything on how it could be. To Camus, this refusal to face the present is a betrayal of clarity. Living on hope is living on delay. It's believing happiness is always later, after graduation, after getting the job, after buying the house, after retirement, or after death. How many people live like this? As if life were just a waiting room for something greater. As if every hardship needs a future reward. As if every injustice will be corrected in some eternal court. Camus cuts this illusion at the root. He writes, "Hope, like suicide, is a denial of the absurd." In other words, both suicide and hope are ways of avoiding the clash between our deep desire for meaning and the silence of the universe. Suicide says, "I won't play." Hope says, "I'll keep playing, because something out there will explain it all." But in both cases, we step away from the absurd instead of facing it. Here's the darker side of rejecting hope. It reveals a hidden desperation. Only those who can't bear the lack of meaning feel the need to invent one, hidden in a future they may never reach. So hope isn't courage, it's fear. Fear of lucidity, fear of living with no guarantees. Important. When Camus criticizes hope, he's not attacking everyday optimism, like wishing someone recovers from illness or hoping it rains during a drought. He's talking about transcendent hope, the kind that depends on salvation, paradise, or a grand final purpose. That kind of hope, he says, puts us to sleep. It distances us from the responsibility of living right now. That's why Camus calls it metaphysical cowardice. Cowardice, because it abandons the only space where life really happens, the present. Metaphysical, because it relies on invisible promises that can't be seen, touched, or proven. So, what's left when we reject hope? We're left with life, just as it is. We're left with the harshness of the present, but also with the chance to live without illusions. Camus isn't inviting us to despair. He's inviting us to be brave. Brave enough to see life without painkillers. Brave enough to love what slowly kills us, as he once put it. It's a tragic love, a love with no promises, but it's real because it doesn't rely on lies to exist. Rejecting hope also means rejecting the idea that we owe something to the future. How many times have you put off living thinking, it's not the right time yet? How many times have you over-sacrificed, believing, later it will all make sense? Camus tells us, stop that. Live without waiting. Choose the here and now, even if it has no ultimate explanation. Yes, that's scary. Without hope, everything feels raw. But it's in that rawness that life shows itself in full color. It's only when we stop waiting that we finally start living. The absurd man doesn't believe in paradise, but he can still admire a sunset, even knowing it means nothing. He doesn't expect divine justice, but he acts with compassion, because human pain is the only real thing he can understand. He's not looking for redemption, but he finds greatness in simply staying on his feet. Camus invites us to replace hope with revolt. To rebel against the absurd is not to run from it, but to stand and face it. To say, I know nothing is guaranteed. I know everything could end tomorrow. But I choose to live today anyway. That's the ethic of refusal. An ethic without transcendence, but full of dignity. A life without eternal promises, but rich with presence. And here's the paradox. By letting go of hope, we find a deeper freedom. We're no longer chained to the future, no longer stuck chasing a meaning someone else invented. We can live fully, knowing each moment is unrepeatable. This path is demanding. It's much easier to cling to hope. But Camus never chose the easy road. He chose the honest one. And he invites us to do the same. Living without hope doesn't mean living without joy. It means finding joy in what's real, in what's right in front of us, without needing eternity to justify it. Have you ever noticed how hope can be an excuse not to live in the present? What would change in your life if you stopped waiting for a perfect tomorrow and finally started living now? After rejecting suicide as a solution and dismissing hope as an escape, Camus leaves us with an unavoidable question. What's left? If we can't end our lives and we can't wait for something to save us, what do we do in the face of an indifferent, silent, and meaningless universe? Camus' answer is as simple as it is brutal. Revolt. In The Rebel, he says that revolt is the only response left to us in the face of the absurd. But be careful. This isn't a revolt that promises victory, salvation, or meaning. It's a tragic revolt, one that doesn't change the outcome, but changes how we face it. To revolt for Camus is to say, I know life has no ultimate meaning, but even so, I won't give up. I'll keep going. It's like Sisyphus pushing his rock up the hill, fully aware that it will roll back down again. The effort is pointless, but the act of continuing becomes something noble. So revolt isn't about fighting death or denying mortality. Those are battles we can't win. Revolt is about refusing to give in. It's about resisting the urge to numb ourselves with illusions. It's about standing up to the temptation of handing our life over to nothingness. Camus writes, I rebel, therefore we exist. That line reveals something powerful. Revolt isn't just personal. It connects us. Because when I refuse to surrender, I'm also recognizing the dignity of others who are fighting alongside me. I'm saying, we're all mortal, all living in this absurd world, but none of us has to kneel. This is where the ethical side of revolt begins. It's not about finding some hidden truth. It's about building a sense of solidarity among people who are all equally lost. Not because some divine law commands it, but because we share the same tragic condition. Still, this way of living comes at a price. Revolt doesn't offer any guarantees. There's no salvation at the end, no final victory, no promise of reward. The person who revolts acts out of dignity, not because they'll be rewarded for it. And that's the hardest part to accept. Revolt is an ethical act without hope. This is where Camus breaks from other thinkers. For Kierkegaard, the way out of the absurd was a leap of faith toward God. For Marx, it was the historical revolution that would free people from alienation. For Nietzsche, it was the eternal return, a bold, Dionysian affirmation of life. Camus rejects all of that. He doesn't believe in heaven, or in history saving us, or in eternal cycles. For him, only the present remains. And in that present, revolt is the only way to stay standing. But what does it mean to live in revolt in everyday life? It means not accepting suffering as some divine punishment. It means rejecting ideologies that promise a perfect future at the cost of present freedom. It means not looking away from other people's pain, even when we know there's no cosmic justice. In The Plague, Camus makes this clear. The characters who fight the epidemic don't do it because they believe in some final victory. They know the plague could return at any time. They fight because they can't stand to see others suffer needlessly. They fight without guarantees, simply because it's human to resist. That's the heart of revolt, acting without promises, resisting without illusions, living without transcendence. Of course, that kind of stance comes with anxiety. To live in revolt is to know that we're fighting an unbeatable enemy, the absurd. We can't defeat it. At best, we can face it head-on without bowing our heads. That's why revolt is tragic, because it doesn't change the ending. But it's still dignified. Dignified because it chooses clarity over lies. Dignified because it chooses solidarity over selfishness. Dignified because it chooses presence over delay. Dignified because it affirms life, even knowing it has no why. Camus doesn't offer comfort. He offers something much harder: responsibility. The responsibility to live without excuses, without illusions, without handing our freedom over to gods, systems, or utopias. It's a demanding way to live, but deeply human. Because deep down, we already know there are no guarantees. Revolt is just the courage to live based on that truth. And maybe that's why it matters more than ever today. In a world full of easy promises, of religious salvation, of technological progress, of instant happiness, Camus urges us to question everything, to ask, are we really living? Or are we just waiting for meaning that will never come? Revolt is a response for the here and now. It doesn't tell us what life will become. It doesn't offer the certainty of success, but it gives us back the dignity of choosing. In the end, to live in revolt is to live like Sisyphus, pushing the stone, knowing it will fall, yet still finding greatness in that useless gesture. Camus invites us to imagine Sisyphus happy, not because he beat the absurd, but because he refused to kneel before it. There are tragedies that don't choose their victims. They follow no logic, make no distinction between the guilty and the innocent, don't reward the good or punish the bad. They just happen, cold, impersonal, indifferent. That's the ground Albert Camus stands on in one of his most powerful novels, The Plague. Published in 1947, shortly after World War II, the book tells the story of an epidemic that hits the Algerian city of Oran. But more than a narrative about disease, The Plague is an allegory about the absurdity of collective evil. Camus wrote it as a metaphor for both the Nazi occupation and for human suffering in general. Evil spreads like a plague, irrational, senseless, without justification. And this is the key idea: absurd evil. For Camus, evil can't be explained by any theological or moral logic. It's not divine punishment, not a test of faith, not part of some mysterious plan. Evil is simply a raw fact of existence, a sudden eruption of suffering that answers no metaphysical questions. In The Plague, the entire city is held hostage by this invisible force. People die, regardless of age, class, or character. There's no justice, no order, only chaos. The epidemic brutally reveals that the universe is indifferent to our human ideas of merit and blame. And it's precisely this indifference that makes the experience of the plague feel so absurd. Because as humans, we need to interpret suffering. We want to believe it has a cause, that it fits into a bigger picture, that it serves some purpose. But in the face of the plague, all those interpretations fall apart. Camus exposes the limits of theologies that try to explain pain as punishment or a spiritual trial. In Oran, there's no way to justify the death of an innocent child as part of a divine plan. That kind of reasoning, to him, is metaphysical dishonesty, a way to deny the absurd. And yet, even when there's no explanation, suffering still demands a response. Not a cosmic response, a human one. And that's where the true ethical core of the novel emerges. The characters in the plague have no way to defeat evil. They can't overcome the epidemic with faith or turn it into some form of redemption. What they can do is resist. They care for the sick, comfort the grieving, fight to stop the spread, even knowing that, in the end, evil never disappears entirely. Dr. Ryu, the main character, is the perfect example of this stance. He doesn't believe in God. He doesn't cling to promises. He knows the plague is absurd, and even so, he chooses to fight. He chooses to heal, even though he knows he can't save everyone. He chooses to act, not for a reward, but simply because it's human to resist the suffering of others. In one of the novel's most powerful moments, Ryo says, "The only way to fight the plague is with honesty." Honesty here means refusing illusions. It means accepting that the epidemic has no meaning, but that doesn't free us from the responsibility to act. It means owning up to the fact that we're not heroes or saviors, just ordinary men and women trying to ease the unbearable weight of the absurd. This is a deeply Camusian stance. To live without hope, but also without giving up. To recognize absurd evil and still choose solidarity. It's important to note that Camus never romanticizes the plague. He doesn't turn suffering into a moral lesson or a path to transcendence. He shows evil in its impersonal brutality, and because of that, demands a real and human response from us. And that's the challenge he gives us. If there's no cosmic justice, then it's up to us to take on the task of compassion. Not because we'll be rewarded, but because we can't stand to watch others suffer. The plague reminds us that evil can return at any time. Epidemics, wars, natural or social disasters, they always haunt humanity. There's no final victory. The plague may disappear for years, but it always comes back. The absurd is a constant, and that leaves us with a disturbing question. How do we live knowing evil will never be wiped out? Camus' answer is harsh but clear. We live in revolt. We resist. We choose solidarity over indifference every single day. We accept that each action is limited, but still necessary. That's the ethical meaning of the absurd. Not fighting for a future reward, but acting simply because someone is suffering right now. Not waiting for the universe to be just, but choosing to act justly, even when nothing makes sense. In recent years, the world lived through a real-life plague with the global pandemic, and it was impossible not to think of Camus. Once again, we saw collective suffering, invisible fear, and the collapse of certainty. Once again, we saw pain spreading without logic, and once again, we were called to resist through solidarity, not because of some cosmic promise, but because real lives were at risk. Camus remains relevant because he forces us to drop easy answers. Absurd evil can't be explained. It can only be faced, and facing it doesn't guarantee victory. It just means refusing to surrender. That refusal is tragic, but it's also the most human thing we can do, because when we choose to resist, we're claiming our dignity. We're saying, even if the universe is indifferent, we don't have to be. If there's no God, no destiny, no cosmic justice or promise of eternity, what's left of morality? That's the question that troubles many when they come face to face with the philosophy of the absurd. Without some higher foundation, aren't we at risk of falling into nihilism, where everything is allowed and nothing really matters? Albert Camus offers a surprising response to this dilemma. He proposes an ethics without transcendence, a human morality, built for this world, with no appeal to future rewards or fear of divine punishment. In other words, doing good even when there's no ultimate reason to do so. At first glance, this seems contradictory. Why would anyone choose to do good if there's no eternal law demanding it? Why sacrifice, be fair, or show compassion if in the end everything dies and nothing lasts? Camus' answer is simple, yet deeply demanding, because it's human. In The Rebel, he explains that the revolt against absurdity isn't just personal. When I refuse to accept life's lack of meaning, I'm not only standing up for my own dignity, I'm also recognizing the dignity of others. I'm saying, if I suffer without justification, then I can't justify anyone else's suffering either. This gives rise to a paradoxical kind of ethics, one with no metaphysical foundation, but deeply rooted in concrete solidarity. This kind of compassion doesn't come from divine commandments or absolute philosophical systems. It comes from our shared condition. We're all in the same boat, finite, vulnerable, and faced with the absurd. This awareness creates a quiet sense of brotherhood, a responsibility that doesn't need eternal justifications. The dark side of this ethics is exactly its fragility. It doesn't offer salvation. It doesn't promise victory. It doesn't provide certainty. It's a morality sustained only by clarity and the courage not to give in to indifference. Camus challenges us to act out of sheer human duty, not because we'll be rewarded in heaven or remembered by history, but because someone stands in front of us, right now, in need. That's why the plague is such a powerful example. Dr. Rieu doesn't fight the epidemic because he believes he'll defeat evil once and for all. He fights because he can't stand to see people die without doing anything. He acts not out of hope, but out of compassion. Camus shows us that true heroism isn't found in those who promise salvation, but in those who resist without illusion. In those who keep acting, even knowing evil can't be fully erased. This ethics is tragic, because it doesn't offer comfort, but it's also freeing, because it gives us full responsibility. We don't need to wait for divine commandments. We don't need to wait for a final judgment. We can act here and now with dignity, simply because we choose not to be part of the indifference. This stance takes maturity. It's much easier to hide behind ready-made systems, dogmas, or promises. But Camus invites us to embrace a morality without crutches. A morality that doesn't rely on absolute reasons, but that commits to humanity simply because humans suffer. Here's the crucial point. For Camus, compassion doesn't need a foundation. It doesn't come from cosmic laws or eternal contracts. It comes from experiencing the absurd. When I understand that my pain has no justification, I also understand that the pain of others is just as absurd, and that I cannot add to it. It begins as a negative morality. Don't hurt, don't humiliate, don't oppress. But it becomes something positive too. Welcome, help, resist the impersonal evil that threatens all of us. This ethics of the absurd is deeply human, but also deeply lonely, because it offers no guarantees. You do good, but you know no heaven will record it. You act justly, but you know history may forget. You show compassion, but you know the universe doesn't care, and yet you act. That's the dark side and the greatness of this moral stance. It's not sustained by promises, but by dignity. Not by hope, but by revolt. Camus believed that once we let go of absolutes, we find a more authentic kind of ethics, one that isn't imposed, but chosen, one that isn't guaranteed, but lived. This compassion without foundation forces us to ask, what stops us from being cruel if everything is absurd? And the answer is harsh. Nothing stops us, except our own decision. That's why this ethics is so demanding, because it can't be outsourced. There's no higher power to excuse us, no destiny to guide us. It's just us, only us, and that's where Camus finds the greatness of the human being, in choosing the good even when it's not required to make life meaningful, in refusing the universe's indifference, not with answers, but with compassion. This is the ethical revolt of the absurd, a revolt that doesn't save, but resists, that doesn't promise eternity, but sustains the present, that doesn't stand on certainty, but is grounded in the dignity of not giving up. How is it possible to love something that will inevitably destroy us? That's the question Camus poses when he talks about loving what kills us. It sounds almost contradictory, but it captures the most radical spirit of his philosophy of the absurd. Camus understood that life, at its core, is tragic. We're born to die. Everything we build will eventually fall apart. All joy, is fleeting. And pain too. Nothing lasts. Nothing stays. Time wears everything down. And yet, he invites us to love life precisely because of its fragility. Not with a naive love that turns a blind eye to pain. Not with a self-serving love that only values pleasure or reward. But with a tragic, clear-eyed, almost brutal kind of love. Loving life because it's brief, because it's absurd, because it promises nothing. That's what Camus calls a luminous nihilism. Unlike dark nihilism, which sees the lack of meaning as total ruin, Camus' luminous nihilism is a form of affirmation, a yes to life, even without a reason, an embrace of the absurd, without escape and without numbing. He writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "What is a rebel man? A man who says no. But what is an absurd man? A man who, in the face of the absurd, says yes." That yes isn't easy. It doesn't come from comfort. It comes from pain, from the awareness that living also means walking toward death, from the recognition that life itself is the force that will eventually undo us. And paradoxically, that's where tragic love is born. Because if life were eternal, if there were guarantees, it might not feel as intense. What makes each moment precious is the certainty that it will end. That's why the absurd man doesn't try to escape time. He dives into it. He doesn't seek eternity, but presence. He doesn't ask for salvation, but fullness. This kind of tragic love carries something Dionysian. Camus draws close here to Nietzsche, who spoke of amor fati, love of fate, including its harshest parts. Loving not just pleasure, but pain. Not just the rise, but the fall. Not just life, but also death. Camus shares that spirit, but in his own way. He doesn't talk about the eternity of return like Nietzsche. He talks about the intensity of the present. To love absurd life is to love the now, without hoping it repeats, without needing it to make sense. It's living as if each moment were the only one, because it truly is. But we have to admit, this kind of love is lonely, because the person who loves absurd life knows there's no ultimate reason behind it. He can't lean on God or on promises of immortality. He loves without illusion, and that distances him from many. While others find comfort in hope, he stays awake, and that awareness can be heavy. Even so, Camus insists this is the only honest love, the only one that doesn't betray lucidity, the only one that doesn't turn life into a stepping stone towards something else. To love absurd life is to love life for itself, not for some future destiny. And here lies the paradoxical beauty of this outlook. The more tragic life reveals itself to be, the more urgent it becomes to live it fully. The more aware we are of death, the more intensely we love the moment. The more we accept the absurd, the freer we become to affirm what exists. This love isn't easy. It takes courage. It requires us to face the lack of guarantees, the pain of loneliness, the full awareness of our limits. But for Camus, this is where human greatness lies, in the ability to love without needing eternity. The absurd man doesn't love life because it's perfect. He loves it because it's real, because it's the only true thing he owns. He even embraces its contradictions, its pain, its defeats. He chooses to say yes, even when everything seems to push him toward no. That's why Camus insists we imagine Sisyphus happy. Not happy because he conquered tragedy, but because he transformed it into dignity. Sisyphus pushes his rock knowing it will fall, and still finds greatness in doing it again. That's the symbol of tragic love, accepting life as it is, and still choosing to affirm it. But what does this mean for us in everyday life? It means looking at ordinary days, our work, our routines, our relationships, and choosing to live them without expecting some higher meaning to be hidden inside. It means finding beauty in a morning coffee, in a real conversation, in a quiet sunset. Not because those things last, but because they don't. It also means embracing pain when it comes, not denying it, not justifying it, not calling it a lesson from God, just living it as part of the absurd and still continuing to say yes to life. That's Camus's tragic love, not loving life despite the absurd, but loving life with the absurd. Not because life promises something, but because it's all we have. And in the end, maybe that's the purest kind of love. Because it's free. It asks for nothing in return. It doesn't expect rewards. It simply affirms what exists, and does so with an intensity no religious hope could ever match. Is clarity a gift or a curse? For Camus, it's both. Seeing the world as it truly is, without illusions, is freeing, but also devastating. Becoming aware of the absurd brings a rare kind of clarity, but that same clarity can become a prison with no way out. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus describes the absurd as the clash between our deep human need for meaning and the cold silence of the universe. When that clash becomes clear, when the curtain of illusion falls, a person starts living in a state of constant wakefulness. They're fully awake, and because of that, condemned. The lucid person can no longer hide behind promises of eternity or easy explanations. They can't pretend suffering has a purpose or that death will be made right in some other realm. They know there are no guarantees, no salvation. And living with that awareness, day after day, is carrying an enormous weight. Camus acknowledges that burden. He writes, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn." But to scorn isn't to ignore. It's to stare directly into the void and still keep going. The problem is that not everyone can bear that extended gaze. Clarity, when it's extreme, can become unbearable. And that's where the darkest side of the absurd appears, the prison of awareness. Once you've seen, you can't unsee. Once you've awakened, you can't go back to sleep. It's like standing at the edge of an endless abyss and knowing you'll have to keep living right next to it every single day. This state is similar to what the Greeks called tragedy, not just as a one-time misfortune, but as a condition of being. The tragic hero doesn't escape their fate. They face it with dignity. Camus' lucid man is a modern tragic hero. He finds no comfort, but he also doesn't give up. Still, that constant awareness comes with a high psychological and existential price. Clarity can lead to loneliness, because most people would rather live among comforting illusions. It can lead to isolation, because those who refuse to pretend often seem strange to others. It can even lead to the temptation of suicide, because being painfully aware of the void can, at times, feel unbearable. That's why Camus begins his philosophy with the question of suicide. Is life worth living? He knows that clarity can become a suffocating prison. And yet, his answer is to not give in. Here lies the paradox. This prison isn't made of physical bars, but of awareness itself. The lucid person is doomed to stay awake, even when it hurts. They can't believe again in what they've already seen as false. They can't return to the comfort of hope. Their freedom becomes their cage. Camus never romanticizes this condition. He doesn't claim clarity leads to happiness. On the contrary, often it leads only to anxiety. But to him, that anxiety is more dignified than numbness, because staying awake, even in the face of horror, is still living authentically. It's as if clarity were a blade. It cuts, it wounds, but it also opens paths. It hurts, but it frees you from the slavery of illusion. And for Camus, it's better to bleed in truth than to sleep in the comfort of lies. Still, recognizing clarity as a prison doesn't mean giving up on it. It means learning how to live within it, to carry the weight of the absurd without letting it paralyze you, to accept that there is no higher escape, but that there's still greatness in standing tall. That greatness is tragic, but also deeply human, because we are the only creatures who can stare into the void and still say yes to life, who can recognize the absence of meaning and still create small, temporary ones, who can live knowing death is coming and still love the moment we're in. This is what Camus calls revolt. Revolt is the act that turns the prison of clarity into dignity. It doesn't eliminate the absurd, but it keeps us from being crushed by it. It doesn't save us, but it keeps us free. Free precisely because we refuse false answers. So, the lucid person is someone who learns to live in the prison of the absurd, as if it were their home. They know they can't escape, but they also know they can move within it. They turn their cell into a place of creation. They reject cheap comfort, but find beauty in the act of resistance. This outlook takes courage, but also compassion. Because someone who lives in the absurd understands that everyone else is trapped in it too, whether they realize it or not. That awareness could turn into cynicism, but Camus chooses to turn it into solidarity. If we're all in the same condition, then we have no choice but to care for each other. Yes, the lucid person is trapped, but they can still choose how to live in that prison. They can choose cynicism, indifference, selfishness, or they can choose revolt, compassion, and dignity. Camus bets on the second. In the end, the prison of clarity is also proof of our freedom. Because if there's no outside escape, then everything depends on us. Every action, every word, every choice is ours. The universe may be indifferent, but we don't have to be. If you made it this far, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the ideas of Albert Camus and the darker, but deeply human side of the absurd. Talking about life, death, loneliness, and rebellion isn't easy, but it's exactly these kinds of conversations that help us live with more clarity and courage. Now, I want to invite you to keep exploring this journey with me. If this video made you think, brought you some clarity, or even left you with new questions, leave a like. It really helps the channel reach more people who are also searching for this kind of reflection. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Here, we explore philosophy in a direct, human, and transformative way. And I really want to hear from you. Which of Camus' ideas hit you the hardest? Was it the question of suicide, the idea of rebellion, the rejection of hope, or the tragic love for life? Leave a comment. Your thoughts might inspire someone else who's reading. Also, share this video with someone who might need to hear this. Maybe a friend who's feeling lost, or someone going through a moment of deep reflection. Sometimes, a conversation like this can make all the difference. Stick around and check out the other videos on the channel. There's a lot of content that can help you go even deeper into your philosophical journey, and maybe even find strength in that absurd clarity we all carry inside us. Once again, thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.